We go to leave first thing in the morning, it's early, and a prison bus with its police van goes by. And we're on our way to HUG for 2018, Holopaw Ural Gathering down in Holopaw, Florida. We got an early start in the morning, headed out, and we jumped on I-75 South. At this point, we haven't made it to Macon yet. And you can see I'm going between 60 and 65 usually. We cruised on up to 65 miles per hour and hold that. Ultimately, there were 3 Urals that went with us. My 2017 M70 Retro, my wife's 2017 CT, and a friend of mine, his name's James. He's Big James on the forum if you find him. He was riding I think it's a 2011 Retro. You can see there I'm still between the 60 to 65. And we're headed down to just south of Macon where we're going to meet up with James at this point. And the plan is simply to ride all the way down into Florida, take the Turnpike, head over to Orlando, down to the St. Cloud area, and then over to Holopaw Ural. I'm always apprehensive when I start a long trip. I think about the whole trip. I think about getting there, and that's not what I should be doing. Once I get rolling and I break it down to the next stop, to where I'm going to be going next, whether it's to McDonald's to get breakfast, or we're going to head down to the next fuel stop, or perhaps if the trip is broken up town to town, I try to think about the next town rather than thinking about the entire trip and getting the whole thing in my head. Once I get going and relax, it's fantastic. And on a motorcycle, I tend to look around more and focus more. I mean, you're riding a motorcycle, so you have to focus, as opposed to riding in a car. If I'm in a car or a truck, the problem is I kind of just daydream. I zone out. I can go several miles without even thinking about where I am. I'm not looking around. I'm not looking at scenery. I'm not noticing anything. I'm just in autopilot cruising. And on a motorcycle, that doesn't happen for me. I feel like I've been there. It's the difference between seeing scenery on TV versus actually seeing it yourself. Again, quick freeze of the speedo there for you so you can see how fast I'm going. Beautiful sunrise on the horizon. Interstate's fairly calm, open, and we're just enjoying our ride at this point. The speeds pick up a little bit as we go, but we do tend to stay around that 65 mile per hour mark while we're cruising. I don't mind riding on the interstate. In many ways, I find it safer because all the traffic has a common goal to move forward. I can do 65. I can even cruise at 70 mile an hour if I want to. And everything's fine. I don't have all these crossroads with cars pulling out in front of me or slamming on brakes or cutting me off or oncoming drifting into my lane. That doesn't mean that you can't pay attention while you're on the interstate, but again, I just don't find it intimidating. But we made it down to the McDonald's and went in and had a good breakfast before we hit the road in earnest. And at this point, James has not joined us yet. He's actually on his way. I find out when I stop, he sent me a text message. So I think we waited maybe 10, 15 minutes for him at most, and then we stayed in the McDonald's about a half hour to have breakfast before we set out on the interstate, all 3 of us in a row. And this is about the only time I ever eat at McDonald's is for breakfast. I like their egg cheese biscuits. But the real reason I like to stop at McDonald's while we're traveling is, not always, but most of the time their bathrooms are clean. And that's my primary concern. I have some stories I could tell you about other fast food places I don't stop anymore because there was always a common trend of very dirty restrooms. Now the rigs ran great on the way down. We didn't have any major issues, nothing certainly that would leave us walking. I did have a oil leak develop on mine behind the cush seal on the alternator, and also found out once we got down there that the alternator was also having an issue. I like to try to get behind a large vehicle that's traveling and just follow them. You could see that RV that we were behind. Now we were behind a truck as things happen, and we get to our first fuel stop. We refueled about every 110 to 120 miles, specifically because of the 2011 retro and the tank size. You can see James going there. His mileage and everything, it kept us right around 120.
Where am I getting oil all over my boot from?
And I noticed the oil on my boot for the first time. A lot of oil. I checked the rig over, but believe it or not, I couldn't find where that oil was coming from at the time.
What? It's oil. I'm gonna have to find out where this oil's coming from first of all.
But I really couldn't find where the oil was coming from. I saw a little bit on the engine and underneath, but I just didn't know at that time where exactly it was pouring out. So I checked the oil level. It wasn't that low, and that pretty much is because the oil leak had just started. So I topped the oil off and we hit the road for another 110 miles or so, and I kept an eye on my boot as we were traveling to kind of make sure it wasn't blowing oil out everywhere at a impressive rate, enough to damage the engine or anything, but it seemed to just remain fairly constant where it was at. Now, if I were to get a ticket in a 70-mile-per-hour zone on the interstate while riding a Ural, they would probably give me a medal, not a ticket. So my wife pulled ahead and she led for a while, and I always appreciate that because when I'm leading, I'm not just paying attention to what's in front of me, I'm paying attention to her behind me to make sure she doesn't disappear and I ride off and leave her. I'm watching for traffic. I'm more focused when I'm leading, and that tends to be a little bit more exhausting than when you're following. When I'm following, I at least am not as concerned about what's behind me, and I'm not having to think about what exit it is or where we're going or whatever the case may be. So I do enjoy following her rather than leading, just because it gives me a chance to kind of relax and take it easy and to look around. And here we are, time for another fuel stop. I think this may be the one where we actually had some lunch. It's definitely the one where I found the leak. So yes, I found the leak. It was coming from between the alternator and the top of the housing, top of the engine housing, was leaking out at a not overly bad, but a much faster rate than it had before. The cush seal up there had gone bad. The good news is I can keep riding.
It's running out this side over here. See it?
It stops already.
Yeah, we're about ready.
All right.
So belly's full, tank's full, oil mopped up a little bit, added a little bit more to it, and we're back on the interstate headed down to Holopaw, Florida. The cruise was uneventful on the way down other than the scare of the oil leak, but it's really just a top-end oil leak, nothing dangerous. Now that I knew what it was, wasn't concerned about it. Went down, hit the turnpike there, not too far from right about now. My camera dies, so at a brief stop, I had changed the camera out to one that was charged, and here we are arriving. It's actually a little darker than it looks. The camera makes it look brighter than it actually was. As you can see, our lights are on, and the truck's lights were on. It makes it look like it was broad daylight, but it was well into dusk when we got here. and we pulled into the little Lakeside Inn motel where we stayed just before Holopaw. And while I was there, the sun went down rapidly, and it created just a perfect photo opportunity framed by the palm trees over the lake there. I took it first, and then I realized, I should probably put some motorcycles out there. Watch for part 2. My wife gets a new pusher on hers, and we solve the mystery of the oil leak. Not only do I get a new cush seal, but we learned that the alternator needed to be replaced too. And then Sigmund meets his twin brother.